Okay, what I'll do is I'll introduce Paul Doyle here first, and then I'll do a brief presentation. Paul completed his Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering in 1969 at the University of Florida, and his Master's in Civil Engineering in 74 from the University of Idaho. Paul has over 35 years of dedicated and practical experience in the field of river hydrology and water resource management. Prior to his extensive 20-year career with the BC Ministry of Environment in Kamloops, Paul held positions with the U.S. Army, U.S. Forest Service, and U.S. Geological Survey, as well as a research position with the Alberta Research Council. Since leaving the Ministry of Environment, Paul has spent the last 9 years working in the private consulting sector, working as a private consultant. During his career, he has provided hydrotechnical advice in the preparation for, during, and after floods and flood threats on numerous streams in British Columbia. In the 1980s, he designed and managed dozens of stream bank protection projects. In 1996, he participated in setting up criteria for evaluating applications for flood mitigation projects around the province, and then conducted the evaluations of dozens of these projects for several years thereafter. He has conducted hydrologic and hydraulic reviews of hundreds of significant proposals to ascertain potential impacts of projects on landowners, public infrastructure, and stream habitat. For many years, he has been a primary advocate for the provincial floodplain management program in the region, and has repeatedly explained and defended the decisions made to restrict development in flood and erosion-prone areas. Since 1975, he has authored and co-authored dozens of practical reports and papers that have attempted to answer genuine questions that have arisen in the course of his work, including the development of an ice jam manual for emergency responders in British Columbia. Paul now has a brief presentation for you.
After that introduction, I don't know if we're talking about the same guy. I'm just pretty much a regular Joe, but we'll spend a few minutes here. I'm hoping to just maybe get some of your intellectual juices flowing with a few slides that highlight a few points that I'd like to make to you folks tonight about floodplain management. Calvin thought it a good idea that someone that had worked in the government, provincial government for quite a while, in the floodplain management field, give a brief talk and be here to answer some questions that you might have. At some point in the advertisements for this gathering, I saw something that suggested that I was retired. But to quote another famous person of some repute, Mark Twain, the rumor of my retirement was grossly exaggerated. I am still, and have been since I left the provincial government, still working. So anyways, we'll move ahead here. And the first couple of slides that you'll see are going to deal with the floodplain management program in British Columbia, where we started from and where we've gotten to at this time. And these bullets are for as much for my own benefit, so I don't forget some important points. And as I said, perhaps to have you folks think about what you might want to ask further or delve into more. Up until 1974, thereabouts, there wasn't any flood development program on the floodplains in British Columbia. To me and a lot of you folks here, that doesn't seem like that long ago, but that was the case. And it was the 1972 flood in parts of BC that got the government thinking that we should perhaps try to control development on these floodplains. Increasing population, moving on to the floodplains, and when you get fair high water, all kinds of bad things happen. And it was particularly as part of that impetus what happened at the Oak Hills Dike on the North Thompson River in the city of Kamloops. Many of you probably remember that even. The dike that was in place at that time failed, and then a lot of the people that were living on the floodplain behind the dike got very wet. And that was one of a series of things that triggered the government to say, geez, we got to do something. So by the mid-70s, a few years later, there was a floodplain development control policy in place for the province of British Columbia. There were a few bugs, as any new program of that size would likely entail. And as an example of that, what I clearly remember when I started working for environment in Kamloops in 1979 was that the database that we were working off of at the time suggested that the Skeena River and or the Bulkley River were in the Thompson-Nicola Regional District. So when I say a few bugs in the system, that's an example. But that eventually got sorted out, and the next point that I want to emphasize, and created no end of back and forth between the province and local governments, is this one. That the local government, right from the get-go with that program, has always had the responsibility for land use, development, and planning. And that was always a bone of contention for as long as I worked for the government. So what's transpired here in the last few years is probably no surprise. But that has not changed. The province, through the Ministry of Environment, would sort of set the standards for the floodplain management program, but it was always the local government who was responsible for regulating and implementing that particular program. And they had a variety of tools in which to do that. So the program was run out of Victoria until the early 80s. And if Don Dobson had been here tonight, he could easily verify everything that you're listening to now about it. And then it was transferred out to the regions, and the regions took full responsibility for running the floodplain program. And it was more or less stationary for 20 years or so. Nothing changed. You know, things got pretty well squared away over a couple of decades, as you might imagine. But then with the change in government back in the early 2000s, 2001, there was quite a few changes in the provincial government, one of which was the provincial government downloaded the program to local governments. In other words, what had been a provincial basis for floodplain management was fragmented, if you like, for lack of a better term, to each local government. I'll have a bit more to say about that in a minute. But when that happened, I had been out of government for a while myself, but I had some misgivings, as did most people who did work for the Ministry of Environment in the floodplain area. Okay. So, just to highlight what I believe, and I think anybody else working in the program would concur with, are that back in the early 70s, when the floodplain management program got going, it did bring some order out of what had been a very chaotic state of affairs. You can imagine now everybody's fairly used to having a floodplain management program in place in British Columbia, as most other jurisdictions in the first world. But up until then, it was the Wild West on the floodplain, and many other areas, actually. So, bringing that order has helped to keep people safe and also minimize property damage in any new developments since it was instituted, 35 years or so back now. And that's a true fact. I was just thinking earlier tonight, I can't think of a single serious incident. Mind you, we haven't had any real big floods since then. But I can't think of a single serious incident in the Kamloops office, which stretched over a fairly large area of southern interior, where anybody has gotten anything more than wet feet, and very few of those, if they abided by the controls that have been in place. So that's a pretty good show. It's also, again, part of the same package, made individuals and other government officials well aware of the flood hazard and or risk. And again, I'm from the old school, so this idea of consequences that was discussed here a few minutes ago is probably a very good idea, but you got to start with something, and certainly just this standard of the 200-year flood has proven to be very much better than what existed before. And another major thing, which is Salmon River being one of those rivers that has been floodplain mapped, the lower Salmon anyways. And floodplain mapping is sort of the first-class result of the floodplain development program, in that it signifies, and you can look on a map and see what sort of area you're in. Are you in a real bad spot, or are you in a pretty safe area? So floodplain mapping in much of the province now, any well populated area has been floodplain mapped, the streams. And I didn't know it at the time, because as an engineer I sort of became much more aware over the years of the importance of the environment and the ecology in any of these riparian areas. But certainly in the early going, even more so, that as a secondary effect of the floodplain mapping program, there were some riparian areas were preserved to a certain extent, much more than they would have been had there not been a floodplain management program. So overall, I think that with the province stepping in and creating this program, we've all benefited as citizens of British Columbia from it. It's been, I've been involved in a lot of provincial programs in the Ministry of Environment, and this was one of the better, if not the best one, certainly. Okay. So, doesn't matter, either one. That's good, over right there. Even some of you folks that live in Salmon Arm, you're probably not aware of just how big the floodplain is, the 200-year floodplain, sort of the standard floodplain extent on the Salmon River. But the little triangle up in the top center of the photo that you're looking at is the intersection of, I think it's a 10th in the Trans-Canada Highway, if I've got it right. You know, we're going west, east where it splits. So, and just to the left center, you can see the Salmon River there, and that's a pretty big area, and everything north of the Trans-Canada Highway is supposedly inundated under the 200-year flood, and even south of or upstream of the Trans-Canada Highway, that's a lot of area that would be inundated were we to get a 200-year flood. So, moving from that,